Hello, welcome back to Central University. This is Practical Faith, a study from the book of James. And this is session 3. We'll be studying chapter 3 of the book of James. Hope you've been able to read the book of James frequently, consistently. It's such a short book that there's a real opportunity for you to dig in and read it and reread it, and you will glean and pick up more things as you do that. Today's a pretty short chapter. Chapter 3 only has 18 verses to it. Once again, the content that he's going to deal with here is very relevant for you and me. I'm going to begin in verse 1 of chapter 3. He says, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness." And right off the bat, that's a little unnerving for me, being somebody who teaches so much. When James says, "Not many of you should become teachers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness." Now he's going to begin to talk about our tongue and the way that we speak and the influence that we have with our tongue. Verse 2, "For we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle his whole body. If we put bits in the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are so large and driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things." I'll stop there for a moment because James begins to get into some examples that deal with this idea of the tongue and being able to control the tongue. He shares some examples, starts with horses, the idea of a horse, such a large, powerful, strong animal. But we control a horse by putting a simple bit into the mouth of the horse. And he talks about ships and how large they are. And think about not only the ships that James would have seen in his day, but the ships now that we create and how those ships are so large and yet they're driven by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. And his analogy is this: so also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. He goes on to bring some more analogy to it. He says, how great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. Now he's going to get very direct and you're going to feel how important this is to James. He says and the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell. Wow, James, tell us how you really feel about this tongue that is so powerful. He says, for every kind of beast and reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. So James he is just laying it down for us right here about our tongue and how uncontrollable it is. As a matter of fact, he says no human can tame the tongue. Without God's help, we have no ability to completely tame our tongue. We are always going to say things that we shouldn't have said, and we're going to hurt people in ways that we shouldn't have hurt them. Without God's help, there is not much we can do. He says we can tame every animal on the planet, but we can't control our own tongue. he gives the analogy of a forest fire and how it is set, how that forest fire is set by such a small flame. Today I was at a house fire here in McAllister, and it's always amazing to me to see the destruction that comes from someone throwing a cigarette in a bad location, or some kind of really small spark or flame, and the destruction that it caused. That's what James is saying to us about our tongue. That it can set on fire our entire life. Think about how much of our life is determined by the way that we speak. Think about how many problems and issues we have stepped into because of our tongue. Think about how many issues we've had in relationships because of our tongue. That's the point that James is making. He says our tongue is set on fire by hell itself. Now, I don't think James could actually come up with something stronger than those words. He wants you and I to understand that the tongue has incredible power, and we must bring it under the submission of Christ. Look at what he goes on to say. In verse 9, he says, with our tongue we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. One of the issues with the tongue is the inconsistency of it. Our inability to speak consistently. He says that we curse our brothers and we bless our Lord. How can that be? How can those things both come from the same tongue? What James is after is consistency when it comes to the way that we speak. It reminds me of a passage in Ephesians where Paul says these words, "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only what is useful for building others up according to their needs." That's what our tongue should be used for. It should be used for life. It should be used for encouragement. It should be used to bring about good things. And yet what we find many times in our lives is how our tongue can take us opposite directions. We can bless God. We can bless people. We can speak life to people. And we can turn around and we can curse people. And we can hurt people. And we can speak death to them. James is saying that to be a follower is to surrender our tongue to God. A follower of Jesus knows that their tongue can sabotage their walk with the Lord. How would you evaluate your tongue in your life? How would you evaluate the things that you speak, the things that you say, even the things that you say to yourself, the things that you mutter under your breath, the things that you say when you think nobody else is hearing you? What would you say about your tongue? Do you struggle with the inconsistency of that? Do you realize the power of the tongue in your own life? Do you realize the power that you wield when you speak negativity into all kinds of situations? When you run down other people? Do you understand the impact that you have when you tear somebody down, how much it impacts them and how much it impacts yourself? That's why James says the tongue is a restless evil that no one can tame. But with God, all things are possible. All things are possible. He goes on to the second section in this short chapter, starting in verse 13. He says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. Now let me stop there for just a moment, because he's going to do some contrast here. He says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it through his life, through his good conduct, and through the meekness of his wisdom, which I don't know what all James meant by that, but when he says the meekness of his wisdom, I hear him speaking to humility, wisdom, and discernment, but a certain type of wisdom and discernment, a meekness, which is the idea of power under control. It has to do with the idea of humility. He's going to speak more about that in a minute. He says, don't have bitterness, bitter jealousy, and selfish ambition in your heart. That's not the wisdom that comes from above. That's the wisdom that is from the earth, is from the world. Now, I want you just to zero in with me on these last three verses, because there is a lot to chew on, a lot to focus on. Verse 16, he says, for where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile practice. But the wisdom from above. Now you remember that's a reference to chapter 1 that we looked at a couple of lessons ago, where he talks about every good and perfect gift is from above. And remember, he talks in chapter 1 about if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. Let him ask the Father, and God will give you wisdom. And then it comes from above, and it's good, and it's perfect. And so now he's kind of nailing that down more here in chapter 3 when he says, the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. Now that is quite a list for us to look at today. He says the wisdom that comes from God, the wisdom that comes from above is first of all pure. Okay? It's pure. Then it's peaceable. Wisdom from God has to do with peace. Wisdom from God will make us peacemakers. Wisdom from above will cause us not to be people that create strife or discord or stir things up or create conflict or go along with conflict, but peace, but wisdom from God, wisdom that comes from above will make us peaceable. And he kind of carries on with that same theme when he says, not only that, but it will make us gentle. Now that's part of the idea of meekness. Meekness is power under control. Gentleness. Just think about this wisdom that James is describing, that we should walk in. That if we ask God for, this is what he's going to give us. This wisdom that he gives us is going to be pure, and it's going to be full of peace, and it's going to be gentle. We're also in the midst of that wisdom. We're going to be open to reason. Boy, is that something we need to hear today. In the world that we live, we have lost our ability to be open to reason. When you think about the things going on in our world, and we become so dug in our positions, we believe that we have everything figured out, and we are so sunk in. Everybody else has it wrong, we have it right, we understand what's right and wrong, and we are just completely sunk in, and we are not open to anything. James says that when you receive wisdom from God, you are going to be open to reason. your heart's going to stay open. Your mind's going to stay open. Your ears are going to stay open. You're going to be able to hear things. You're going to have the humility to be able to hear things. Wisdom from God. Open to reason. Where do you need to be open to reason? Where do you need to be more humble in what you hear? He also says that wisdom from above is going to be full of mercy. He spoke to us about that in chapter 2 when he says that mercy triumphs over judgment. Wisdom that comes from God is merciful. It's merciful. You think of it this way: you are wise when you are merciful. You are wise when you show mercy to people. It is wisdom from above. It's wisdom from God. Full of mercy, he says, and good fruits. Wisdom from God is going to produce good fruits in our lives. He goes on to say that wisdom from above is impartial. Now, we heard that in chapter 2 as well, didn't we? The idea of not showing favoritism, not discriminating against, not being prejudiced. Wisdom from God is impartial. It's impartial and sincere. I can't think of a word that should describe us as followers of Jesus more than the word sincere. Sincere, authentic, transparent, vulnerable, open, nothing hidden in our lives. Sincere has to do with the idea of integrity. Like I said, has to do with the idea of authenticity. Wisdom from God will make us sincere. You know, when I look at that list, what comes to mind as I just reread that list to you? I want you just to think about the kind of wisdom that God is longing to give us and how that would change our life. Pure, peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy, impartial, and sincere. Wow, there is a list that we should be striving for. We should be longing for. Or as James said in James chapter 1, that's a list we should be asking God for. He says, if you want wisdom, ask of him. Ask of him and he will give it to you. Believe that he's going to give it to you. But I want you to know today that when he gives you wisdom, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to look like meekness. It's going to look like purity, peace, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy, impartial, and sincere. It's a different kind of wisdom than what the world talks about. Wisdom looks different when we follow Jesus. He closes out this chapter by saying, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Church, we should be peacemakers. We should be peace lovers. We should be peacemakers. We should be peaceful. Listen, there is no place in the church for us to just love violence or evil or war. Or listen, Jesus was a peacemaker. You remember when Jesus was being arrested in the garden and Peter comes to his defense and tries to slice off a man's head and he cuts off his ear. And Jesus stops Peter and tells him to put his sword away. And he picks up the ear and puts it back on the head of the very man, the soldier, the servant of the high priest who was there to arrest him. Jesus heals him as he's being arrested. Listen, there is a lesson for you and me about God's desire for us to be peace lovers. I encourage you to think long and hard about what it means to live in the wisdom of peace. So today in James chapter 3, we hear how the tongue is so powerful and that we are not going to be able to tame it outside of the work of God in our lives, but that we should be looking to Him to help control and to take our tongue and to discipline it and to change it in the way that we speak and bring consistency to the way that we speak. And then he goes through these verses about wisdom and what the wisdom from God looks like. I think it's so profound that I would encourage you to read and reread it and circle those words and think about those things in your own life. So we have a couple chapters left in James. That is James chapter 3. So I hope you'll continue to read James chapter 4, James chapter 5, and look forward to exploring those with you.